All right, guys. I have 6:30, so I say we get started. I was telling some folks that were on here earlier that it's crazy how weeds bind us all together. um, let me start out with a few housekeeping things. We'll just ask that everybody stay muted because we are recording this to have as future reference. And speaking of recording, once we get all this uploaded to YouTube and everything, and upon the conclusion of tonight's class, I'll send out an email to all of you with a link to a Google Drive that will have tonight's presentation, the video, and several other resources. I think it's in, it'll be in the first folder, Melody's Monday Classes, and then it's folder 14 in that folder where you'll find everything for tonight's class. Also, we'll ask that if you have questions, to throw those in the chat box. Jenny's going to be moderating that. Yeah, wait, Jenny Thompson, there you are. Yeah. So I know that I've already been getting several emails today with some weed identification. So if you have some of those with with photographs, we'll ask that you send those to my email or to our Ask Us portal upon conclusion of tonight's class, because that'll be hard to identify some of those over Zoom. So, but any questions you have, again, just throw those in chat box and we'll save those. We'll do like I did last week. We'll go in and answer those questions and send a copy of that out to everyone that participated tonight. So again, welcome to everyone. We're so glad you're here. And of course, weeds are a huge topic this time of year. Just this morning, bright and early, I was out. I made about a 12-minute video at my house of common weeds that we see in bloom right now. So that's also going to be in the Google Drive for your reference. One of the reasons I was asking where everybody was from is because even though I am in East Tennessee, as the crow flies, I grew up in Western North Carolina, just 50 miles over the mountain. But weeds, certain names that we called weeds, are not what folks here in East Tennessee call weeds, and it was a learning curve for me 20 years ago. So many of the weeds that I talk about refer to those common names are going to be maybe a little bit different depending on where you are in the country, even in the South, from state to state. So just be aware of that. So for tonight's purposes, I'm not going to be speaking a lot about the Latin. I think a lot of these common name weeds are ones that you're going to be familiar with. But hopefully you'll gain a better understanding of the weeds and how to better be able to control those in the lawn, landscape, and garden. So as we jump in here again, just make sure you're muted and we will get started. So what exactly is a weed? And the big thing here to realize is that that could mean a different thing to each one of us.
Mine too loud.
Some of us, what we call weeds may not be weeds to others, and vice versa. But basically a weed is just any unwanted plant. It's a wild plant that's going to grow where it's not wanted, and it's going to be in competition with any plants that we are cultivating. Again, whether that's in our garden, our lawn, our orchard, whatever. The best control for weeds, and I know y'all are going to be sitting there laughing at me right now, but prevention is the key. And of course, we wouldn't all be on here right now if we could prevent the pesky little things from growing in the first place, right? But again, prevention is the key, but we're going to give you a toolbox tonight. We're going to fill this toolbox up as we go, and hopefully, you know, give you what you need to be able to identify and be able to control these effectively, considering timing of these weeds. So just to kind of get us started with some trivial things, just some facts about weed seeds. Did you know that undisturbed weed seed tend to persist longer than any seeds that are going to be subjected to periodic tillage? And we'll talk more about these in detail as we move through. And weed seeds that are deeply worked in the soil, they're going to tend to last longer than seeds that are shallowly worked in the soil. That might that might sound counterintuitive, but that's true. And seeds that are deep in the soil are going to be stored below what we term the germination zone, and that's going to be different again depending on where we're at in specific parts of the state or even in the region or the country. Grass seed weeds tend to be a little bit less persistent than any of our broadleaf weed seeds. And then the number of surviving seeds of most any weed species is going to decline rapidly after that first year. But then thereafter, the rate of weed seed is going to decline very slowly. And some seeds are going to persist. They're going to outlive us, and you're going to see some of those as we move through tonight. So what's the difference between these weeds and why does it matter? So keep this slide in the back of your mind, and some of you probably already know this, but grasses are going to be those multi-stem plants with a really fibrous, dense root system. And once those get established, it's going to be really difficult to control without injuring any kind of vegetable crop like in our garden. So it's best to try to get control of that first before we plant a garden. Grasses are going to be very competitive, making harvest difficult. They can provide a nice little layer, you know, from that seed to soil or soil to plant contact as far as disease, but we really don't want grasses in there because they can take over. Think Bermuda grass. So broadleaf weeds, those are any weeds that are going to grow upright. They're going to have that taproot system, which makes them a little bit easier to pull than grasses. And if they are in our gardens, if you watch that video that I made this morning at my own house in my own garden, you'll see that some of those are going to be a little bit easier to pull in and around some of our vegetable plants than what the grasses would. So to kind of get us started, I'm going to just share with you some common weeds, and then we're going to talk about some of maybe the pros and cons, or what some of these weeds may actually indicate to you if you see them growing wild. So this is Joe Pie weed, and again, what I consider a weed might not be what some of you consider a weed, and vice versa. So for me, this is not one that I call a weed. This is one that I actually like growing on my property. But this is Joe Pie weed. This one here is poison hemlock or water hemlock. It's a member of the carrot family. This is a prolific bloomer right now. You're probably seeing this everywhere. It's very invasive. It is toxic. And you can see how tall that is. It's pretty prevalent throughout the southeast region. This is one that a lot of folks blame for sneezing in the fall, but this is actually goldenrod. It's not ragweed. This is goldenrod. You're not going to suffer allergies from this. Usually, pollen's way too small, and it's too sticky to spread into the air like ragweed. This is one that we see in the springtime, early springtime. We call it Creeping Charlie. It's going to go by other names depending on where you're at, but it can be a rather invasive, what we call a ground vine. Dock, and there's going to be many different species of this throughout the southeast as well. This is not the only one, but we're seeing this in high prevalence right now. Purple loosestrife, again, this is one that some are going to consider an ornamental, if you will. They're not going to consider it a weed. Same thing goes with foxtail. Some folks are actually going to want this in a wetland marsh setting. So that brings us kind of full circle. So what do all of those plants that we just saw, what do they all have in common? So they're going to be indicative to you of a wet, swampy area in your landscape or on your property, at least at some point throughout the year. So if you see any of these growing prolifically and you didn't deliberately plant them, then you know that that's going to be what we consider one of those wetland, swampy areas. So you can come back in with other ornamentals and plant things like dogwoods and willows and irises in those locations, and they're going to perform quite well, because they all like wet feet. The purple loosestrife here, it can be invasive and take over. So if you do like that as an ornamental, be cautious with that. Here's one that we see growing right now, summer bloomer called chicory. It is one of those famous, we've got somebody here actually from Louisiana, so she probably knows this one well. It's a coffee substitute as well, very bold, bitter taste to that. This is white clover. Again, a lot of folks are not going to consider it a weed. It's going to run rampant in a lot of lawns, mine included, but I see it as a pollinator potential. This is one field bindweed. Looks kind of similar to a morning glory. The thing that's bad about it is that it can get caught up in your tillers if you're using any kind of mechanical equipment, so it can be hard to control from that vantage point. And then we have lupines, and this one is one that's starting to grow in popularity in regards to being a cover crop of sort. But again, when we see all of these on our property, what are they telling us? That we have a serious compaction problem. So even though weeds are bad, we may deem some of these as bad, but what they're trying to tell us is a story. And you know, just like I was talking about the white clover in our lawns, think about how we're mowing in the same place from week to week, or in our case here in East Tennessee right now, twice a week. And we're continually riding over that grass, compacting it. So white clover, when we see that, if we haven't deliberately seeded that, that's one reason it'll come in and take over, because it's going to do quite well in those compacted areas. The other thing, though, the other benefit to some of these is that they're going to give nitrogen back into the soil. So even though, again, they can take over the universe, especially the clovers, they are going to feed the soil. And wild mustard that we see pretty prolifically in the spring, that too is going to indicate a compacted soil. But any kind of brassica, think of your cole crops that we plant in the garden. You know how shallow rooted those crops are. Those are actually going to do well in a compacted soil. So if you're moving to a property and you have that issue, growing cole crops can actually do well for you. All right, so our next series here, this is what we term sorrel. Stinging nettles, we've actually got Russ on here from West Virginia that grows these for a tea. Stinging nettles have some great health benefits, but some folks are going to consider that an invasive species just because they do have those little stickers on it. Here's one of Jenny's favorite plants. It's one of nature's toilet paper plants, the mullein. This one is growing in abundance right now along the roadsides. And of course, dandelion that we see frequently throughout, well, even now. I had a shot this morning of a seed head in my landscape. But all of these are going to tell you that you have a high, or a low pH soil rather, I'm sorry. So in your landscape, if you have these weeds growing, if you like hydrangeas, then they're going to turn blue on you. So, you know, that could indicate a plant that you could put in that area, as well as some of our native woodland species like rhododendrons and azaleas and things like that. All right, just a few more slides before we get deep into it. We're just warming you up on some of this weed ID. So this is one called peppergrass. That's kind of blurry on my end. I don't know if that's blurry for y'all. Sorry about that. Salad burnet. Some folks will actually grow this for its cucumber flavor as an herb. Same with this one, rose campion. And then stinkweed. And of course, all of these are going to tell you that you have a sweet soil. So think Vidalia onions. We've got some folks here from Atlanta, Georgia. So, you know, not too far from you guys is where the Vidalia onions grow pretty fondly in that sweet, rich soil. That's because it's high in potassium, actually, is what that means. So in your landscape, if you have these things growing, things like baby's breath and lavender, candy tuft, pinks, all of those are going to perform well where you see these type weeds growing. Any of the artemisias, there's about 250 different species of those, or what we call wormwoods, wild radish, mugworts, and then of course Queen Anne's lace, or our wild carrot. And then daisies. Those are all going to indicate a pretty depleted soil. So the reason I show all these slides is to tell you that weeds that are growing prevalently on our property are telling you something that you need to do to correct that problem. That can help us deplete that seed supply of weed seeds in that soil above that germination zone. So just like these plants here, you know, they're telling us that we have a depleted soil. So if we're beefing up our soil, whether it be for our turf grass area or within our gardens or in our flower beds, then, you know, we can help kind of push out these and actually allow more room for our plants that we're wanting to cultivate to grow.
Melody?
Yes.
We have a real quick question.
Okay.
Kim has harvested dandelions to eat, but the ones growing in her lawn now have fuzzy leaves. What does that indicate?
It's just a different species. There's multiple species of that, but it's not going to hurt anything.
Okay. Thank you.
Think about also wildflowers. A lot of us plant those for pollinator gardens. Those actually kind of prefer depleted soil too. So if you have an area that you're trying to beef up to plant flower beds or to put a garden or an orchard or a vineyard, then wildflowers can serve a dual purpose there. These are some of the winter annual weeds, and again we're going to talk about these a little bit more in detail in a few minutes, but the henbits and the dead nettles, chickweeds, lamb's quarter, all of these are going to tell you that you have a happy, rich soil. So as much as we hate these weeds in the springtime, we see that vast array of purple and white growing pretty profusely. That's actually telling you you've got a really good soil. So pretty much anything, anywhere you see this growing, you're going to have a good, rich soil to pretty much grow anything. Here's one. I got a question on this earlier today. This is going to go by different names, but this is pigweed or amaranth. You can see there's a couple of different kinds. This one's got the spines and this one is the smooth, but they're all going to act the same and all kind of tell you the same thing. But if you have a pretty high occurrence of this, that's telling you got a really high amount of nitrogen in your soil. So if you're doing a soil test in a garden area that's growing these pretty prevalently, it's probably not going to give you a recommendation to add that nitrogen back. But you can see what that root system there looks like. Actually, in that video this morning, I couldn't even pull that up by my hand. You can see how vast that taproot is. So when we're wanting to control this weed, this is the stage where we want to do that. We obviously don't want to let it get to this stage because all those seeds are just going to go right into the soil and come back and be a continual problem for you for years to come. If you've red red clover or any mustard or purslane that's growing naturally that you didn't plant, that's going to be some indicators there too. Red clover is going to tell you got a higher potassium level, and again, even in Greene County, we tend to have those areas, pockets of high potassium as well as high phosphorus areas. So if you see that mustard growing in abundance, that's what that's going to tell you. So again, just kind of trying to wet your whiskers and get us an introduction to some of these or identification of some of these weeds or these plants. But remember that weeds are going to be those plants that are going to thrive in any disturbed environment. So all these things that we've been talking about, that they're going to, you know, indicate to us what kind of soil we have and what can grow naturally there. We also have to think that when we do go in there and disturb that soil, you know, think about if you're building a house or if you go out to till up a garden spot or dig out an area to put a flower bed, you know, or if we're cropping fields, farm fields, they're all annual plants, right? They're only going to live for one season. So that's why these weed seeds are going to have an advantage. When we kill off that natural vegetation and we're disturbing that soil, then that's, you know, when we're going in there to plant our radish seeds or our cotton seeds for cropland, we're opening that ground up for weed germination to occur. So that's going to be an excellent habitat. But the reason that weeds are so bad is because they're going to decrease yields. I don't know if you can see this here, but this is actually watermelons. And it was like I was saying earlier, you can see the grass species here. That's going to be almost impossible to even find a watermelon in a mess like that, right? So they're ultimately going to compete with nutrition, all that fertility. Any of that lime that you're putting on there, weeds are going to compete for that. And we have some garden vegetables, as you've heard me say repeatedly in the last several weeks, that are just not going to compete with weed seeds. So anything in your allium family, like onions and chives, even carrots, they're just not going to compete. You're not even really going to get much of a yield if you have an area that looks like this. So the reason that weeds are going to be an annual problem for us, again, is just because of seed dormancy. As you see here in the next few slides, they're going to be prolific seed producers. You could probably tell from that seed head on that pigweed, holy moly, thousands of seeds that one plant's going to produce. Just the spread of seed is going to be through so many different mechanisms, and we're doing it ourselves too, unintentionally. But we can carry that spread of seed as well as birds, other various wildlife. The other thing about weeds is that they're going to have those really fast growing vegetative structures, so they're going to outgrow some of the plants that we're wanting to get established, and they're just highly adaptable. They've thrived in these conditions for years, and they can acclimate really quickly, almost like insect pest resistance to certain chemicals. That's one way to look at it. So I threw this slide in here just to give you some background on what that soil seed bank is. Hopefully it'll just provide a little bit of a broader understanding of that, but that's just that natural storage of seeds. Often those are going to be dormant and they're within the soil of most any ecosystem. There are weed seeds everywhere. The study of the soil seed bank started back in 1859 with Charles Darwin. He actually observed the emergence of seedlings using soil samples from the bottom of a lake. And that's kind of how this whole process got started. But that soil seed bank is where the problem lies, basically, is because that plant's persistence is going to be ensured by that seed bank. So again, timing of control of these weeds is what's going to be critical to help us reduce that soil seed bank, you know, for our garden area or for our landscape area. Seeds are going to be deposited, they're going to be stored, and then they're going to be later removed for use. Again, whether that's intentional or unintentional, but anytime we're disturbing that soil, we're disrupting that soil seed bank. And oftentimes we don't know what's there until boom, we've got nutsedge, glory mornings, and pigweed growing in our gardens and no vegetables, and we feel like we're fighting a losing battle. And I speak from experience there. So those of you that know me know that I have fought those three weeds pretty repeatedly for the last several years. The good thing is that in that soil seed bank, not all seeds are going to survive for whatever reason. But the other thing to be wary of there, last week we talked about composting and tossing our weeds into that compost pile, but a lot of weed seeds can survive even that high heat in a compost bin. So if you have weeds that have that seed head on them, chunk them elsewhere. Don't throw them in the compost bin. Even if you have some weeds that have those rhizome or tuberous structures, that's not always good to put in that compost bin either, unless it's, well, that's just not a good practice to get into. So be really cautious with some of those weed species. All right, so as we start filling up the toolbox, one of the best things you can do is invest in a weed ID book. Of course, we as extension agents are here for you in the counties, and we can serve as a great source for you, as well as some of our Master Gardener volunteers that are answering questions as well. This is not one that I have, but it was just a good picture to be able to tuck it in my toolbox there. But I don't know if y'all can see this one and get it up close to my camera. And I'll share this with you in the Google Drive. I like this book because it's going to give you full color pages. It's going to give you the different stages of that weed, which you're going to find that's going to be really useful. And the reason I say that again is because it's just like anytime we talk about controlling insects, disease, or weeds, timing is of the essence. If we just buy a herbicide and we go out here and we start spritzing, that's not necessarily going to control that weed. And actually, an herbicide is not our first line of defense when it comes to weeds. A lot of people find that surprising, but you'll notice that when we start building our toolbox, that's going to be one of the last things that we even look at. So keep that tucked in the back of your mind. Invest in a good weed book, reference manual, or a good online source, something like that. We're going to build our arsenal tonight. But to do that, I've preached a lot on life cycle already, so we're going to just jump right in there. We're going to look at annuals. Of course, those are going to seed to seed in one season. Then we move to our biennials, and so they're going to basically grow their foliage to rosette to seed in 1 to 2 seasons or years. So foliage will be the first year, fruit or seed production the second year. And then we move into our perennials. That's the majority of our broadleafs. Some part of that plant is going to live for more than 1 year, whether that be the rhizome, tuber, or the stem. And I don't want to make things confusing, but there's going to be several weeds that they're going to be an annual, but we're going to refer to them as a perennial, or vice versa for how we treat those plants. And maybe to illustrate what I'm talking about, some of you know that borage is one of my favorite herbs in the garden, but to get it started, you need one plant. So technically it's an annual plant, but it's going to reseed itself. And unless we have just a horrible winter, then just through that reseeding, the next year you're going to have multiple plants. So weed seeds are going to act a lot like that. So think about some of those plants that you have in the garden that act that way. Think about Bermuda grass, which I consider that a weed. I know some people have that as a long grass, but think about even Bermuda, how it spreads and it encroaches and everything. You know, it's a living part of that plant that's growing, that is causing the issue. So again, it's kind of going to depend on where that plant is an issue, how we're going to treat it. So again, to just expand on some of that, annuals complete their life cycle in less than a year. They're going to establish from seed each year. We've got two different kinds. We have those summer annuals and winter annuals. So you've heard me talk about the henbit, the dead nettle, the chickweeds, and all those a little bit earlier. So to illustrate that better, those are winter annuals. So by the time you see those plants growing in your garden or next to your mailbox or down your driveway or whatever in the springtime, is that when you want to go out there and utilize a herbicide to control that? No, because a winter annual, they're going to germinate in the fall and winter, and then they're going to mature and die in the spring and early summer. So, you know, think about where you saw that henbit, dead nettle, and chickweed a couple months ago. Do you see it now? Probably not. Well, Mother Nature's kind of throwing us for a loop, because I did see a little bit of that at my house this morning. So I'm not going to say that's always true. But as the higher temperatures of summer come in, those winter annuals die off. So use that as an illustration, because if we want to control those, then around Thanksgiving is when we want to be applying an herbicide to control those from germinating altogether. And I just put this in here just to kind of show you the schematic of how that works. They do, again, reproduce by seed. Another big factor with those is they don't need those food reserves. They're not going to be storing carbohydrates. Think about your daffodil bulbs. I'm one of those OCD people, so after the bloom is spent and that foliage starts dying back, and you know, it gets brown and kind of slimy and ugly, you just want to go in there and trim it off.
It's 7 o'clock.
Hey folks, can you mute, please? But anyway, you want to go in there and you want to trim that foliage off because it's ugly and unsightly, right? But don't do that, because that's food for that next year's flower to bloom. It's going to continually produce food. So the thing about an annual weed is they don't need to do that. So that's another reason that they get a little bit of a leg up there. And I kind of already jumped ahead of myself there. So yeah, we'll just jump right into a few more of these. Hairy bittercress, that's another winter annual weed. It's going to have a pretty nice long taproot, but this is one we don't see quite as frequently as we do some of the others. But you'll notice there again that it's going to germinate in October, November. So if we have an issue with this, then we want to be controlling it around Thanksgiving. And I've already talked about the chickweeds. Oh, and those are edible plants, by the way. A lot of these are going to be edible. And I'll point out some of the ones that are not. But you'll notice here on the henbit that sometimes we consider that a biennial. Again, so it is a pretty prolific bloomer in the early spring. It's in the mint family. If you eat the edible, it's going to taste like raw kale. And what makes this unique is that it's only going to spread by seed. And there's your chickweed. Some folks will actually use this as a ground cover, use it as a wild edible. This is one that you probably see clumping in your lawns in early spring, and it's really vivid, and the color stands out against the rest of your grass, but it's what we call POA, or annual bluegrass. And notice there, it's going to thrive in that compacted soil again. But notice that seed head. It's going to throw off those seeds in the springtime. So we don't see it right now, right? We're out there mowing our fescue lawns and we don't see this, but it like literally looks like it's taken over the universe in the springtime. But if we're wanting to control that, you notice there when we want to do that, it's going to be late summer and early fall. Purslane, this is one that gets a lot of attention. It is a shallow rooted weed. It's low growing. It is a succulent. A lot of folks will also use this as an edible. It looks like a miniature jade plant. It's going to reproduce by seed and stem pieces. So once we get that seed soil bank started with that, it's got multiple ways of reproducing. And then, you know, one of our favorite here, the pigweed again. These can get really, really tall, y'all, if we let those go. And once they get to this size in the garden, you might as well just kiss it goodbye. There's not a hoe in the universe that's going to tackle that taproot. And even trying to move a tiller in at this point is going to be hard to maneuver. But you can see why we don't want this one going to seed. That little utricle there splits open and you get one dark brown seed, but it persists in the soil for years. Morning Glories. These are going to be pretty quick to identify because it's going to be these two leaves that pop out first, and then that third leaf will always be heart-shaped. So usually if you're going to see that in the garden, that's going to be the best time to reach down and hoe that or pick that. Ragweed, I couldn't believe I couldn't find a single ragweed at my house this morning, but if we're wanting to eradicate that, you can see what those leaves look like. This is the stage we want to do that. Right now, ragweed is probably looking like this right here in late June into July. This is still a better time to control this. We don't want to wait till it gets to this point here. So if you know you've got an issue with that, this is going to be the time to control it. The nutsedges, and there's different kinds of those, as you'll see a little bit later. You'll notice there that some consider it an annual weed, but it's actually a perennial. One way to be able to tell this from a grass, well, number one is that seed head, but number two is that triangle stem. So you know how any plant in the mint family has a square stem? Any nutsedge is going to have a triangle stem. And I say this to you because you know, early on that first couple slides I said grasses and broadleafs. Sedges are more like a grass, but they're troublesome because a lot of our grass herbicides don't have a lot of activity on sedges. They're going to be a little bit tougher for us to control. The other thing that I would highly point out here, don't shake that soil from the roots. If you pick that up or pluck it out of your garden, don't shake it because it's going to spread from these little nodules on the roots. And that's one you don't want to be throwing in your compost pile either. Crabgrass, we're starting to see this right now. A couple of different kinds that are pretty prolific here in Tennessee, the smooth and the southern. Both of these species are going to grow pretty much everywhere though. You can have the southern crabgrass. I've seen it in the New England states. Crabgrass at this point is going to be hard to control. That's why we say when the forsythia bloom to put that crabgrass preventer on your lawn. That's going to take care of that right at that time. This plant's germinating. It needs about 55 degrees soil temp before it'll take off. This is a spurge. There's a prostrate and a nodding spurge. The nodding spurge is starting to overtake pastures and hayfields in our area here in East Tennessee, so it's almost become invasive. You'll notice here that it looks a lot like the Portulaca or the jade that I showed you earlier, but one way that you can determine what it is to break open the stem, and you can see that milky sap. It's going to have that red stem and a really thick, oozy, milky sap that comes out of it. This one is a little bit tougher to control. You want to obviously get it when the first few leaves come out, much smaller than this. The good thing is, though, it's got a very shallow root system, so if you're hand pulling, it's one that is not going to be that bad. Okay, biennials, those are the ones that are going to live for more than a year, but not over 2 years. So think about some of your maybe herbs or other garden plants. Parsley is a biennial. Some of you that went on the wildflower walk with me a couple months ago, you heard me talking about Linaria or the money plant. That's a biennial. Your Queen Anne's lace, the wild carrot, that's going to be one that probably everybody knows. It's going to look like that garden carrot during that first year of growth. We're not going to see that umbel or that inflorescence put out until the second year of growth. So even though it's got that flat surface, we still call it an umbel flower. And if any of you have tried to pull that, you know what kind of thick taproot that it has. So once it gets established, it's very hard to get control of that too. And then that brings us to perennials. Those are the ones that are going to live for more than 2 years. This is where most of our broadleaf species are going to fall. They're going to spread by seed. So think about dandelion and the plantains, and we'll look at some of those in a few minutes. Or they're going to spread by those creeping roots or above ground stems, which are called stolons. So think about strawberries, those are stolons, or the below ground stems, which are called rhizomes. So that would be something like a Bermuda grass. And sometimes they're going to have multiple structures on the same plant, which makes it really hard to control it. As far as timing, when we start thinking about some of those cultural mechanisms, or even if we're going to use an herbicide, one thing to keep in mind is that they are going to have a little bit of a deeper root system, so that's going to determine if you do use a chemical. Again, they can have multiple reproductive structures, and they're going to need those food reserves to sustain them through dormancy, which is another reason if you are applying a chemical, you want to consider that, because you're going to have some translocation that'll move through the plant depending on which chemical you do utilize. And again, just another schematic to show you the difference there with those. And some of the perennial weeds, again, we've already talked about some of these, but you'll notice there quackgrass. I've not showed you a picture of that yet, but that's pretty prevalent right now, especially in some of our wet areas. And then bindweeds, I showed you that a little bit earlier. It's got those really deep, what we call seed storage organs. So once again it gets established, it's hard to control. That's why, again, prevention is the key. Or once we start working on reducing some of these weed seed populations, it takes more than a couple years to do that. It's just like building our soil tilth and structure. It takes a few years to regain control, basically. So Bermuda, or what some people call witchgrass, this is one just to make note of. We don't want to be, again, tossing that in the compost pile. Bag that and get rid of it. It can form that really dense mat. Some folks like this for sports turf or even for lawns. Ground ivy, that's going to have that creeping root system. It's going to have those nodes. It's going to emit a mint-like odor because it is a member of that mint family. But if you do try to hand pull this, again, when it's at that young stage is the best time to get it. That way we're removing all those roots. And then we've got different kinds of buttercup. I threw this one in here. This is the low growing one. And this is one that we're going to see in the springtime along with the henbit and the dead nettle. And it has a corm. So think gladiolas. If anybody plants gladiolas and those little tiny corms. So kind of like the borage I was using a few minutes ago as an example. You plant a few gladiola bulbs, and if you don't separate those, then what happens? You have one gladiola, and then the next year you've got like 5. So imagine with some of these weed species, if we're doing that and just letting them go. That's how they just take hold and take over the universe. If you are not eating the dandelions in your lawn, this is one that is going to be tough to get a hold of as far as an herbicide earlier, or as I've said, you know, and you keep hearing me say that a lot of these are going to be tough to eradicate. But if you are going to utilize an herbicide control, we don't want it going to the seed head. So when we start to see this right here, that's when it's getting ready to push out that seed head, and we really need to have control before that. So again, having that weed ID book is going to help you get acquainted with the foliage. Plantain, we've got multiple species of this in East Tennessee. You can see that seed head right there. Again, why we want to control this before now. So even in my lawn, I mowed on Saturday, and I have seed heads right now in my lawn on plantain. So I'm going to have lots more plantain because all I'm doing is helping throw those seeds into the ground even more. Here's one that we're seeing quite frequently right now, the pokeweed. This one can get very tall. In that video this morning, one behind my house is taller than I am. You can identify it from afar just because of that red stalk. And you'll notice there it's going to be spread by wildlife. So you're going to see this just popping up intermittently everywhere. It's going to be a tough one to control. But the good thing is, even that stalk, as big as it is, it's almost hollow. So it does have a deep root system, and if you don't completely get that root system out, then it's just going to reproduce there at that basal stem right where it goes into the soil line. So even though pruning that back, taking some shears, it's still going to reproduce, so be aware of that, as well as the berries, of course. And we talked about nutsedge already, but here's a picture of what those little bulbettes look like. So that's one reason we don't want to shake that plant off if we do hand pull, because we're just going to be dispersing that. Same thing with wild garlic or the wild onion that some people call that. It's going to reproduce the same way. So think about it. If you have a wild garlic growing in your lawn and you've got one tough or one, you know, pretty stout plant, and you go out there and you dig around and you think you're getting all of it with your spade, and then, you know, before you know it, you've got like this little mass of wild garlic, but they all kind of look puny. Well, that's usually what happens when we do that. When we're separating it, we're not doing it intentionally, but that's just the biology of that plant. So you might lose that one stout plant, but then you get like a mass of puny plants after the fact if we don't remove all these bulbs. Let's see, I got ahead of myself there again. So again, the white clover, it's going to, again, tell you got a compacted soil. This is one that a lot of people can live with. It's going to be difficult to eradicate. I will tell you, if you are spraying your lawn, treating it with an herbicide like 2,4-D, this is one that will perish along with all your broadleaf. Some folks are not aware of that. So even though it's green and low growing and kind of acts like a grass, it's going to act like a broadleaf when it comes to herbicide control. So that may be what you want. So if you're wanting to eradicate that, then a 2,4-D would be the way to go with that. And I'm not going to go into a lot of this biology because in essence of time tonight, but you do have broadleaf, the dicots and the monocots. A good way to describe this would be corn that we grow in our gardens is actually a monocot. Corn is actually a grass. Also Johnson grass, if anybody sees that it kind of looks like corn, that would be a good illustration of what one of those monocot broadleafs are going to look like. Most all of our broadleafs are going to fall into this series of dicots though. You're actually going to see that vein leaf, and they're going to be either herbaceous or woody. And this is just showing you some of the differences, and I'm not going to quiz y'all on this, but one way that we can identify different kinds of grasses is by looking at the collar. So that gives you a better idea of when to control specific grasses. So we were talking about crabgrass earlier. That's when we want to spray or treat our lawns in the springtime as the forsythia blooms, but something like Dallas grass, we're going to wait a little bit later to do that. So that's why identification is going to be key to any control measure. And here's just some more pictures of the broadleaf plantain. And some of these is, we refer to them as stationary perennials because they are going to be more persistent on roadsides, hayfields, pastures. If you have a wetland area, they can be problematic there too. We call them stationary because they're usually not going to be competitive that first year. And if you have means of tilling, usually that can eliminate the majority of those. They are going to establish themselves from seed, and you can gain a little bit of control in some of those adjacent habitats just by heavy planting. Again, go back to the wetland area. Those wandering perennials, we kind of already touched on these. Again, they're spread by those underground rhizomes. You know, the nutsedge is going to have those rhizomes as well as those little bulblets. So that brings us to the seeds, and most of the seeds of these weeds are going to be super, super tiny. And the thing to remember is that that plant is going to have limited resources. Well, most of them. Some of them are kind of cool how they disperse seeds. But when we start, again, disturbing those natural environments, that's when it gets really risky for those seeds to take hold. So that's why we can have offspring from one weed for years and years to come. So weeds are basically going to get started because they take what we refer to as germination cues. So just like if you go out and plant a radish or a carrot or a cucumber seed in the garden, something's got to tell, the environment's got to tell that plant or that seed to grow, right? Some of those seeds we don't want to be planting until the soil temp is just right for it to be able to germinate. We've got to have adequate sunlight. We've got to have water, right? If we take any of those away, then we're not going to have a good chance of that seed getting started, right? Well, it's the same thing with weed seeds. So anytime that we have seedlings, whether it be weed seeds or plants growing in the garden or flowers or whatever, if they're poorly established, then any weed seed is going to be able to come in there and take over. So go back to your garden. If you watch my video, you'll see that, because it's like, seriously, I cannot get in there and weed because Mother Nature keeps throwing rain our way. And of course, I was gone last week, and y'all have heard that story before. So, you know, I go away for a week and I come back and I'm like, wow, look, I've got a great stand of pigweed and morning glories and nutsedge, but where did my cucumbers and my squash go? So just a week can do that if we're not keeping on top of things. But if we really have a poorly established plant, then that's what's going to allow those weeds to come in and take over. Weeds are going to know when other plants are going to be absent. So anytime we have that soil disturbance and we've got water and sunlight, those weed seeds are going to take hold. So seed production. Hey folks, can we mute?
Google is
what I want. See who's muted or who's unmuted. There we go. Okay, so lamb's quarter can produce about 100,000 seeds a year, and some studies even show that we can get over 500,000. That's one plant in that tiny little flower cluster. Now, who would have thought that? And then there's that pigweed again. Right there, that's a good picture of what that root looks like. So you can see how extensive that taproot is. But a red root pigweed can produce 250,000 seeds a year. So you see, if we allow that plant to seed and to flourish, and we go in there and we disturb the soil and we're moving everything around, then we're just dispersing that seed, right, from year to year. This is Melody's favorite plant. This is Harry Galanzoga. I'm just kidding, it's not. But this is one that produces about 40,000 seed and one little flower. So this is a perennial weed, and once it gets established, it does take over the world. Watch my video, you'll see what I mean. I have a carpet of this in my garden, so not only am I fighting those other weeds, but I'm fighting this. Luckily, it's got a really dense fibrous root system, and it's easy to go pluck it, just hand picking, hoeing. Again, shallow rooted, so it's easy to manage. I suspect this came in on manure, which brings up a good point. Same way with my pigweed. I think both of those come in. So if you're purchasing manure, if you're bringing in straw to use as a mulch, if you're buying compost, make sure you know where that's coming from, because all of these weed species can thrive in those conditions, and you can bring them unknowingly home to you. So be careful with that. But one little seed there can produce, or one flower can produce about 40,000 seed. And you can see there what that looks like after it dies off, which is, I never see it look like that. But anyway, you can also see there from the pigweed, just the number of plants and the seed production per plant. Really all you need is one plant to really get a good establishment of the pigweed. And remember that a lot of these weeds, and we term them ag weeds, even in the home garden, they're going to depend on us for dispersal again. So velvet leaf is one I couldn't find this morning taking pictures, but oftentimes that's going to show up inadvertently in feed grain. Again, it's going to show up in manure. On our tillers, any kind of farm equipment that we're using. Again, we can spread this just by the equipment, even on the bottoms of our flip-flops. So be careful if you're going from farm to farm or garden plot to garden plot. And that's what the velvet leaf looks like. Okay, so we've talked a lot about a lot of these weeds already, so I'm going to skip through these because I think I've touched
These
on
are the
them.
top results.
Oops. This one here is a Virginia buttonweed. This is one you're going to see in the springtime pretty frequently. This one is knotweed or smartweed. Sometimes you'll hear it called false indigo. I'm not sure why, but you will. I showed you dock a little bit earlier. This is the curly dock, so you can see the difference in that. These are going to be some of our different grasses there. Of course, that poa or the bluegrass again, Dallas grass, you're going to have your crab grasses, and then the goose grass. And they call it goose grass because of that seed head looks like a goose, but usually it'll have that little spattering in the middle of white. And then you got your sedges here. Anybody living in West Tennessee, you probably see the purple nutsedge a little bit more than the yellow nutsedge. Yellow nutsedge is more prevalent here in East Tennessee. So some key points to remember as we're moving forward. When we break up any of those perennial weeds, that's going to promote sprouting. So again, go back to that wild garlic or the nutsedge, Bermuda grass. Think about that. When you're trying to eradicate it by a hoe or a tiller or any of that, think about how rapidly that's going to spread. So again, we're not doing that intentionally, but that's just how these specific weeds will reproduce. So anytime that we till or those surface conditions, any absence of plants, that's going to stimulate germination. That's going to be a cue for those weed seeds to take hold. Remember that these weed species are going to have characteristic seasons, when they're going to germinate, when they're going to flower, when is going to be the best time for you to control those. Seeds are going to persist in the soil for many years, but they are also going to die at a constant rate. Again, some of these weed seeds are going to outlive some of us. They are going to produce many, many seeds. You saw that just a few minutes ago. Seed size is going to control the depth of emergence and that ability to be able to germinate and emerge through that mulch. So the heavier that mulch is, 6 to 8 inches, not what's on my video. If you go back and watch that later, you'll see how thin that is in some areas and why that hairy galanzoga was able to take hold. All in the name of science, I do this for y'all. But the thicker that mulch is, then it's going to help prevent some of those weeds from emerging. And remember that it's going to be easy to bring in new weed seeds even under the best control measures. So opportunities for control, what everybody's been waiting on, or do they even exist? And again, prevention is going to be that #1 key. But again, when we break up those perennials, it is going to make them sprout, but just like I said a minute ago, each sprout is going to be weaker. If you're utilizing an herbicide, each time you go out there and do a little spot spray of 2,4-D, or some may actually use Roundup, 2,4-D would actually work better on those bulbets. It's going to take more than that one application to spot spray, so just be aware of that. You can use cultivation or tillage to help flush some of those weeds out of the soil, but you better be ready to do some heavy mulching. Make sure you get a good seed bed established. Think about the wildflower analogy again. Most folks want to seed those in the springtime, but if you'll wait till after the threat of frost and sow those in the fall, in the late fall, you'll get a jump on those weed seeds from germinating. Those wildflower seeds will tend to germinate a little bit quicker and give you a 2-week jump on some of those weed seeds. If seeds miss that annual opportunity, this is where it's key. Many of those are going to die before the next year. And then again, more are going to die with tillage. And another thing that's going to help with this when we start incorporating tillage is cover crops. And we're going to do cover crops later in the fall and talk about that. But a lot of those cover crops are going to help us with tillage and help us control some of these weed seeds. Garden against invasion of new weeds. Again, that's going to go back to where you're acquiring your manure and compost and mulch and things like that. So what is that first step? And you've heard me repeat it several times tonight, just identifying what specifically your weed problem is. Some of us may have weeds, but they're not necessarily weeds to us, and we feel like we can live with those. White clover in the lawn, for instance. But if you have some major problems going on in the garden or in the landscape that you can't get control of, really get to know that weed very well. This is where classes like this or reading some of our textbooks, websites, some of our bulletins and publications, things like that can be handy. Hand lens is not going to be probably as necessary for weeds as it would be for insects, but knowing the life cycle, knowing when that plant or that weed is going to germinate to gain the best control. And is the weed the cause or the effect of the problem? You know, that's the other thing to consider. But when we come to managing weeds, if we are maintaining a healthy garden and we've got a biodiverse ecosystem, we've got a lot of different plants planted within that area, and we're not leaving a lot of bare ground. And if we do have bare ground, if we're utilizing a living green mulch like a buckwheat or even a red clover, alyssum, something vegetative on that ground, that's going to help keep those weed seeds from persisting. That's going to help keep those weed seeds from taking those germination cues. Oh, bare ground, sunlight, water, here I come, and I'm going to be here, and I'm going to be a problem for years to come. So if we can just make sure that we're keeping plants on that bare ground, you know, and not having any bare ground, that's really going to help reduce that seed production. When we do see some of those weed seedlings start popping up, that's why a book like this is going to be really handy, because oftentimes when folks bring weeds in here for identification, or when we get those on email or whatever, they're at the point that we really can't control those, or the timing is not right. Those plants are going to die off in a few weeks anyway, and they've already set their seed, they've already done their damage. So that's going to be key, is to eliminate them before they get large. And we're going to do that by targeting those specific growth stages. And you can kind of see there, the more mature it gets, then we lose 3/4 of the control, right? So this is going to be the stage, the seedling stage is where we want to target all of our efforts. And we've talked about all that, but as far as preventatively, if we are purchasing disease-free and weed-free seed and plant material, that's going to be a big help. And anybody that's taken my classes before, you hear me say it probably in every class. If you're purchasing plants, pop that out of the pot, look at it really close. You've heard me say that for disease, making sure we're looking at the root system. We're looking for insects, but now we're in weeds class, right? So we want to pop that open and kind of look around, make sure we don't have any stray weeds that have already germinated. Maybe they're really tiny in those pots, because if we bring those home, then we brought those weeds home too. So always investigate your plants when you purchase and bring those home. If you're buying topsoil or if you're moving topsoil around, just be cognizant of the fact that you could have some weed seeds in there. Again, some of us are moving from location to location. Even at my little 1 acre piece of property in the back corner of my house, I have different weeds, different soil there than I do where my garden is at. So if I'm going back and forth, then I'm increasing that potential. So especially if you're utilizing equipment, make sure you're sanitizing, know what your weed pressure is. Maintain field borders and property edges. And again, all in the name of science. You'll notice the fence rows on my video. Make sure you go back and watch that, because you'll see a pretty heavy stand of weeds that have just taken over that are in those fence rows. So we don't want that. We want to keep that as clean as possible, and again, keep those weeds from going to seed. So now we have our toolbox here, and we've added a hoe, because in the land of gardens, a hoe is truly a gardener's best friend, or a good pair of gloves, because that's usually the best control mechanism for these weeds. And 9 times out of 10, that's how we're going to remove them most effectively. Whether we're mowing, we're hand pulling, hoeing, we're doing some kind of rototilling. Mulch can fall into this category, or any kind of landscape fabric. Just know that if you are mowing, so think wildflowers, we know that there are wildflowers, but that's a good analogy to use. When we're mowing those, then we're dispersing seed. So if we're mowing, it's going to be more effective on broadleafs than it is grasses. It's going to be more effective on any of those annual weeds versus perennial weeds. And perennial weeds are going to take several years of continuous mowing to see any effect. So go back to that plantain that you see growing in my lawn, or the clover that we see growing. It's going to take several years to annihilate those. Tillage, of course, is just going to control a lot of those weeds that have emerged, but we got to be careful because it can damage some of the roots. And of course, tillage or cultivation, that's still going to be used for any of our high value crops, but it's going to be best if we have small weeds. And you'll see there, Happy Harry's House of Hose. So I had to put a little funny in there because nobody likes it when we get to this point in the presentation. It's like, seriously, she's going to tell me to go out there with the hoe? That's all she's got. So you can just go back to look at this little joke a little bit later. So remember, the thing about mechanical is that it's going to give you immediate control. So you're not going to have to worry about application rate. You're not going to have to worry about drift. You're not going to have to worry about residues with chemical runoff or anything like that. So mechanical is going to be instant bang for your buck, instant gratification. But if you, again, have that bare ground after you do a tillage, you know, like run through your garden rows or whatever, go back and throw you a little living cover crop or something in the middle of that, because otherwise we're just sending those germination cues to the weed seeds. Mulch, if you use it right, it's going to be your best friend. If you use it wrong, it'll be your worst enemy. So I think somebody sent a question earlier about straw maybe sprouting in the garden, and usually that's not too big of an issue, but with the weather conditions we've had this year, as wet as it's been, and as soft as that's been, it's been a germination cue for some of that to resprout. And again, just knowing where that source of that straw is coming from, and making sure that it's straw and not hay, because if it's hay, then obviously it is going to sprout. So always know where you're purchasing your mulch. And different mulches, I mean, anything from rock to straw to sawdust to wood chips, anything goes. Grass clippings, any of those would work. But just know the pros and cons of both of those, and that's a whole nother class. So now we've added mulch to our arsenal. Landscape fabric would even fall into that category, as well as plastic, if you're using something like that in your garden or your landscape. And thickness, oftentimes we'll use a 6 mil plastic to cover like a greenhouse. So that's what that means. That's just that thickness weight. Do realize that black plastic is going to prevent any kind of light penetration. Clear and colored are going to allow light penetration. And I think there's a slide at the end of this about soil solarization, which does effectively reduce weed seeds. But you want to use clear, a double layer clear versus black, to get the best control. And there's also going to be a handout on that soil solarization in your Google Drive. So make sure you read that, because it really has come a long way in recent years. And there's more on the mulches. If you are using, you know, we never like to see this humped up against trees. We want to make sure the roots have plenty of room to breathe. Also be aware too that mulches can bring in different fungal organisms. A lot of people will, I know growing up, my grandfather used to say goose in the garden. And with my aunt, that sometimes meant that the goose was chasing her, is what I thought that meant for years. But that was actually a biological method of weed control. So a lot of folks will use chickens and geese, even goats, especially goats for like brambles, multiflora rose, plants like that. They can be very effective. Folks will also utilize grass carp in ponds and lakes. So now we get to the biggie, chemical methods. So that's going to be the herbicides. That's the chemical used to control, suppress, or kill weeds. And that's going to do that by interrupting their normal plant growth process. And so these chemicals are going to act different ways. So if you've been to my insect or disease classes, you've heard me also say that we need to rotate chemicals, that's very important. So the insects and disease don't build up resistance. That's not as necessarily going to be an issue with weed control, because they're going to act by different modes of action anyway. The thing to keep in mind though with chemical method is that it's going to be improved when we do prepare that seed bed well. If we do have crop residue, we want to make sure that we get that turned over early enough in the springtime for the natural microorganisms in the soil to be able to help decompose that. If we're spreading manure or lime and fertilizer, we want to do that by the soil test. We don't necessarily want to be adding that manure and everything lime right as we begin the planting. In the springtime, we want to usually do that soil test in the fall, add that lime application. We do our pre-plant in the spring. We can even do manure in the fall and let that kind of compost down with our cover crop until springtime and turn all that under it at one time. But if we've got a uniform and well-prepared seed bed, that's going to give us a really quick jump on our crop stand. And by crop stand, I mean anything we're growing in the garden, anything we're growing in our flowers, whether it be a wildflower pollinator bed, whether we're growing shrubbery in our landscape beds, or herbs around the mailbox, whatever that case may be, that's what we want. That's what I mean by a crop stand. And by doing that, then we're getting a jump on improved weed control. So that would be the first step before getting to the chemical method. And you'll notice here that I added another character builder here. It's not the backpack sprayer, it's just a normal handheld sprayer. But for home gardeners, we usually recommend 1, 2, or 3 gallon sprayers. 2 gallon usually gets the job done. The thing I would caution you with, though, if you're going to utilize herbicides, is to make sure you have separate ones. Have one for Roundup or the glyphosate, and have one for a 2,4-D broadleaf killer. You don't necessarily be wanting to mix those together. So before you even contemplate utilizing an herbicide, again, making sure we identify what that is. We want to make sure we understand the herbicide label. We want to follow that label, all the guidelines and directions, and only use the recommended amount. Y'all, this is important here. When it's on that label, a little dab more can actually do more harm than good. So keep that in mind. Not necessarily for you, but for the wherever you're applying this chemical, there's a reason for that rate. It's just like when you go to the doctor and you get an antibiotic. You don't want to, if they say take 1 tablet twice a day, you don't want to be taking 4 tablets 3 times a day, right? That's actually going to do you more harm than good, and may end up even doing long-term harm. So same thing here, make sure we're only using that recommended amount. Maintain your equipment, always keep it cleaned out in between uses, only mix up what you're going to need, and don't use on plants that are not listed on the label, and especially with some of these chemicals, because if we get into a non-selective like Roundup, and that's just a trade name, glyphosate is actually the active salt that's in Roundup and a lot of other non-selective weed killers now. But if it's non-selective, it's going to kill everything. So I was talking about Clover a little while ago. So obviously, that's going to work on Clover. It's going to work on anything that you drip it on. It's going to have that residual activity, translocate, move through that plant, and it's going to kill whatever it touches. So be real careful with that. Selective, that's just going to kill some plant species, but not damage others. So we got a couple of different ones here. 2,4-D is the one I talk about pretty frequently, is our broadleaf weed killer. There's 2 formulations of that. There's an ester and an amine formulation. One way that I remember is ester before Easter. It's the volatility of that chemical is what that means. So it's basically to do with temperature. I'm not going to go into all the chemistry of that, but always making sure if you're spraying this 2,4-D broadleaf herbicide to make sure you're getting the right formulation, either ester or amine. Preen, that's a pre-emergent. That's also a selective. Many of you are probably using that, or Weed Be Gone. Also, if you have Johnson grass or Bermuda grass, there's a couple of herbicides. Select is one, Vantage is one. It's only going to kill grasses, but it's not going to hurt your other ornamentals in your landscape beds. So that's another option. Just knowing how these are classified, they are contact or systemic. Again, systemic is going to be your Roundup. It's going to move through that plant. You're going to get some residual activity on that. If it's a contact, it's not going to move readily. That's why more than one application is going to be required. So if any of you have used different chemistries of the Roundup. And now that there's so many names, it's hard to keep all that straight. But there's one that's Roundup 365. There's a Roundup brush killer. So like the Roundup 365, if you read the label on that, if I go out there right now and I spray that fence row that's in that video, do you think I'm going to get any control with that product? I'm going to get a smidgen, but that Roundup 365 is formulated to spray on the bare ground beforehand, and you get 365 days of control. So that's another reason it's going to be really important, especially now that more formulations of all of these are starting to come out, to really research or call your extension agent and know which one of these that you need to be utilizing in which situation. And you'll notice there too that if we have a contact spray like 2,4-D, it's going to cause that localized injury. You're going to be able to see that pretty quick. We do have pre-emergence and post-emergence. I'm starting backwards on all these slides if you notice, but post-emergence, of course, would be Roundup, any of those other grass herbicides I was talking about. Take, for instance, Johnson grass. If you want to spray an herbicide to control Johnson grass, you have to wait till that plant is 18 inches tall before you're going to get adequate control. So a lot of people don't realize that. They'll see it starting to come up because it does look like little corn plants and want to get control, but you're not going to get as adequate control, which again is counterintuitive and kind of goes against the grain, which kind of goes back to knowing what weeds we're dealing with to start with. Pre-emergence, if anybody's using cornmeal, corn gluten, that's going to be considered a pre-emerge. So be careful if you're utilizing that in your garden. It's great, but it can also suppress any garden seeds that you plant. So making sure you get that timing just right is going to be essential with that. Again, when we think about these herbicides, identify what that problem is, make sure we know the various herbicides that are going to be labeled. You know, and it's just like with disease or insects. Start out with the path of least resistance, the safest for you, the environment, the pollinators. Keep all of those things in mind. Integrate management objectives. When you get a weed population that's troublesome, again, don't always think about an herbicide as the go-to method. Oftentimes, again, it's going to be in our arsenal, it's going to be in our toolbox, but it's going to be one of the last options that we utilize because there's other ways we can get control. But it can be a tool, but we can't just expect to go out there and use that herbicide in one application and think that that's going to solve our problem either. It may take a couple of applications, and it's going to take us doing all these other things, hand pulling and hoeing and all that as well. So here's the other thing that I've added to our toolbox. I forgot the gloves earlier, so I put those in there. But this is a garden journal, and a lot of you have heard me preach on that in other classes. And the reason that's important for weed class is, again, to help you jot down when you see specific species, or to take pictures. Like I keep mine, and mine's all digital now, but I used to print them out just on plain paper and put pictures of some of these weeds species that I would see. If I didn't necessarily know what they were, I would just kind of keep track of those things, and then that would help me better plan for the next year. And by doing that, you kind of get a more broadened approach to that integrated management control. Again, because it's not all about one specific mechanism working better than the other. It's going to be that integrated approach. So oftentimes when we read on herbicide labels, it's going to give us amount per 100 gallons, but we break that down for you in this handy little chart to amount per gallon. So that sprayer that I showed in the toolbox, we can bust that down from what's recommended on the label to make it a little bit easier on you. So make sure you refer to this. I've also put some information in there on organic weed control, and I know I'm keeping y'all way too late, so I'm going to speed this up. But again, one of the biggest things, and we should all be doing this, is just working that soil where we're going to be planting, making sure that the weed seeds are going to be exposed to air. They're going to be more easily to germinate. So that's why we're oftentimes going to utilize a living mulch or even like a strip till or a no-till system in those organic systems. And you can even implement that even at home, going through a stale seed bed to plant. Lots of different options that you're going to have to do that, even burning off some of those seed beds. Again, we don't want to be doing the shaky shake out there in the garden. Remove that plant before it flowers. Cover any kind of exposed soil. And a lot of folks will use the full strength white vinegar on the leaves to help kill that above ground portion. But you still need to pull up that plant because the roots are not going to die. Excuse me, because vinegar doesn't translocate through that plant. So it's going to burn that foliage off, but it's not going to move through that foliage to other parts of that plant. Just another thing is to make sure that we're cleaning that equipment again in between uses. Always only mixing what you need, cleaning that sprayer out, flush the hoses and nozzles with clean water, and don't rinse pesticides down a drain. That happens more often than not. And I think I've talked about most of these. Row spacing, if we are utilizing adequate row spacing, then we can have a lot of like squash plants. Bigger plants are going to help shade that area and help prevent some of those weed seeds from germinating. Implementing a cover crop system for both summer and fall through the winter is going to be huge. And then here's your solarization. The big thing here I want to mention is just that now is the time. So if you want to do that, obviously you can't be doing a soil solarization protocol when you've actively got a garden growing. So this is going to be for a future site for a landscape bed or a garden. Now's the time to do that. And again, just using that double layer clear plastic versus black. One last word of caution is on herbicide drift. If you are utilizing a glyphosate, which is Roundup, or a 2,4-D, you as the individual spraying are going to be liable for any of that drift. Now, I say this to you because this is what we call 2,4-D injury. And tomatoes, grapes, tobacco are all going to be super sensitive to 2,4-D drift. And you're saying, well, if I'm really careful, then I'm not going to have any drift. 2,4-D is one of those that can move off target really quickly because it volatilizes. It goes back to that chemistry of that formulation. So we say to apply that chemical between 68 and 86 degrees. Anything that gets really super hot, that's when that material volatilizes and can move for miles off target. Also, if it's a windy day, it's just going to disperse that material to also float for miles. So be very, very careful with that, because when we have 2,4-D injury, it can stunt that plant and actually make it not really safe for edible use. And I don't know if you can kind of tell the difference in this garden, but and this is kind of an interesting fact, but take for instance cows or anything with a rumen. There are certain herbicides that can live through the rumen of an animal. So we're going to spray this hayfield with an herbicide, not you, but some of our cattle producers or whatever. It's called aminopyrrolid, but that hay gets sprayed. Then that cow ingests that hay 6 months, 8 months later, and then that cow poops that out. So we have a manure issue. It's going to be residual that long and live through the rumen of that animal. Or we're going to take those big round hay bales and set in an area of the field that we come back later, even 18 months later, and we can have some severe stunning from that herbicide injury. So, you know, be careful with that if you're growing livestock or growing hay, pasture. Be careful with those herbicides that you're utilizing. If you do go back with a garden spot, just be aware of that. We had that show up here a few years ago in tobacco. We had tobacco going down everywhere, and we finally figured out these big circles was where hay feeders had been. And it was like, oh, that's what that is. So just be cognizant of that. Know what you're dealing with there. Again, several resources are going to be in that Google Drive. They're going to start filtering in really slowly. I've been trying to upload some of those today, but it's taken a little time. But really utilize these. That mobile weed manual is a great resource to have. But the big thing to remember is make no mistake, the weeds will win because nature bats last. So you sat through an hour and a half or so of that, and I'm just telling you, there is nothing you can do to control the weeds. They're going to win. Now, I'm just kidding. It's all about some of those cultural practices is going to be the best mechanism. Prevention is going to be key. So I sped it up there at the end. I really apologize for that, but I really didn't know I was going to go quite that long.